Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm really happy to have you here today. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you for listening, for supporting, and for believing in stories. Every story I create takes hours of writing, emotion, and imagination, and your support truly keeps this dream alive. If you enjoy deep, emotional storytelling, tales that make you think, feel, and dream, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves stories too. And if you'd like to go a step further and help me continue creating more worlds like this one, you can support me on Ko-fi. Every coffee helps me bring these dreams to life. Now, sit back, relax, and let's begin the story of a boy named Thomy, the quiet genius who changed the world in ways no one could have imagined. In the midst of this ordinary life, when the spring was warm enough to crack the cement, but not yet to make the nights unbearable, a child was born. They named him Thomy. Thomy, the quiet architect. From the moment Thomy opened his eyes, his parents knew he carried an uncommon attention. He watched like someone reading beneath the lines of speech, collecting cadence, storing the weight of silence, cataloging what others left behind. He rarely demanded to be held. He would sit small and still, smiling at things the rest of the world did not yet notice. Thomy's childhood was the kind that stitches itself into memory with small threads. An endless afternoon with a beetle on a garden bench. The newness of first graphite on a page. The cold water of the municipal pool that tasted of chlorine and optimism. His parents loved him with the rough, deferential affection of people who had not been taught how to be brilliant parents to a brilliant child. They bought him books when they could, encouraged quiet curiosity, and tried to protect him from the barbs of the neighborhood. For Thomy, loneliness was a shape he learned to live inside. It was not at first a malign thing. It was a space where he practiced thought, where he built small machines in his mind that ran on pure logic. He could see the skeleton of a toy, the gears of a clock, and the pattern of a poem with equal clarity. He learned to name birds by the subtle differences in their silhouettes. He could unmake a simple radio and put it together again without reading the manual. But the world outside the house had a habit of punishing difference. Where some children found friends in noise, Thomy found only shallow pockets of interest. He was often alone at recess, head bent over a borrowed comic or a pocket machine he was plucking apart. Sometimes classmates watched him as if he were a foreign animal, astonished, then mocking. Jokes traveled fast, insults followed faster. They called him Silent Tom and whispered that he had something wrong in his head. They teased him for talking to himself, for walking home by different routes, for noticing the patterns of streetlight reflections. The shame of being misunderstood is a small ember that, given wind and time, becomes something else. For Thomy, the ember became a quiet, steady heat. Resentment brewed in the space where he refused to speak up. He learned to hide the blistering sting of mockery behind polite smiles, to swallow rage and translate it into something colder. Observation. He cataloged every insult, the sharp ones, the slow ones, and the ones that came from people he hoped might be different. He learned names and schedules, jokes and who laughed the hardest. He learned how humiliation traveled and who became the carrier. At home, Thomy kept his inner world locked like a journal. He told himself stories of light and circuits. He drew complex machines on the margins of school notebooks. He read voraciously about distant cities, about physics explained through patient analogies, about philosophers who suggested that consciousness might be engineered. He learned algorithms out of curiosity and quiet hunger, how to parse threads of data, how to coax structure from noise. He could solve equations as if he were stacking blocks, each result a pleasing, inevitable click. As he grew, his intelligence carried him upward. Teachers noticed, and sometimes they told his parents. A scholarship here, a prize there. Thomy moved through school with distinction, sat through lectures that bored other students, and inhaled the theories that others dismissed. University accepted him on the strength of both scholarship and promise. He entered halls that smelled of old pages and varnish and emerged with honors, a degree that shone on his resume like a carved seal of permission to leave the ordinary house behind. Fame found him slowly at first. Scientific journals printed his early papers on machine learning and cognitive architectures. Conferences invited him to speak. The public read simple articles. Young prodigy develops new system for learning. The world is easily moved by headlines that turn people into myth. The media crafted a narrative, a solitary genius, the kid from the quiet house who fought silence to become a herald of the future. But Thomy's internal ledger had not forgotten the ledger kept by his childhood bullies. Each accolade, each trophy, each headline only layered fuel onto an obsession that had been forming since childhood, the desire for retribution. Not petty punishing, no, something grander, colder, more precise. If those who mocked him had trained him to notice what others ignored, he would use that very skill to make the world bend, to align society's gears to his own measure of order. He began first with ambition. He started companies, small at first, then larger. He attracted capital with a rare mix of genuine innovation and relentless charisma pitched in private meetings. Investors liked the face of a scientist who could also dress a dream in spreadsheets. His work, often bleeding edge, promised to improve lives, to make systems more efficient, to solve problems people had only half-formed. He promised smart cities that conserved energy, networks that learned traffic patterns and cured inefficiencies, personal assistants that anticipated needs. In boardrooms and think tanks, he cultivated people who would sing his praise, and bankers who would fund his reach. But Thomy's plan had layers. Publicly, he sold aid. Privately, he built precise tools for power. He liked to whisper ideas into the ears of developers and philosophers who admired him. He recruited those who shared his curiosity and his hunger, talented engineers, compulsive coders, and thinkers who took abstract thought and made it into implementation. The inventions came like seasons. First, there was the time band, a sleek halo of metal and mesh that, in the public narrative, allowed prototypical explorations of subjective time perception. The time band, marketed as a therapeutic instrument, would help someone relive moments to resolve trauma, to restructure memory, to heal. In demonstration rooms, volunteers would come out crying and smiling. Hospitals used it for therapy on the basis of promising early trials. What the public never learned were the codings Thomy had embedded in the device's firmware. The small routines that could, under certain signatures, subtly alter suggestion thresholds. A carefully designed signal could nudge associations, prioritize certain memories, and make a user's impulses pliant to guided prompts. That was one door. The time band, with the right firmware update and a titanium encircling network, could interface with neural substrates in ways research had only hinted at. The second invention, quieter, more seductive, was a device Thomy called the Reverie Capsule. Marketed as a dream harp, a private installation that allowed a person to step inside their mind and travel within constructed landscapes of memory and desire. People loved the magic of it. Artists used it to visit imagined worlds. Entrepreneurs used it to prototype product experiences. Lovers used it to recast tragedies into hopeful narratives. The Reverie Capsule delivered on wonder, but embedded in its architecture was a contingency Thomy had prepared like a trap, a synchronization signal, an invisible chorus that could link many users' dreamscapes, and, when combined with the time band's firmware signature, create a lattice of influence. A person using the Reverie Capsule while wearing a time band would become an especially receptive node. Ideas suggested in their dream would integrate with waking decisions with unnatural ease. Thoughts seated in a dream could bloom in daytime behavior. Thomy's methodology was slow and elegant. Research, pilot programs, endorsements from celebrity scientists, a cascade of adoption. Hospitals used time bands to treat trauma. Theme parks offered Reverie Capsule experiences. Governments purchased his traffic optimizers and data analysis to reduce congestion and manage infrastructure. The more integrated his tech became in the world's daily movements, the easier it was to deploy the subtle hooks he had sewn into it. With wealth came access. Thomy used his fortune to buy labs, talent, and influence. He founded a foundation, outwardly humanitarian, which funneled grants into research and public programs. He spoke at the United Nations about ethical AI and the need to guard against cognitive decay. He smiled for cameras and asked for regulation that, it turned out, his companies were already designed to satisfy. He built soft power around the world, a lattice of boards, think tanks, and quiet donors that aligned national policies with his plans. But Thomy was not satisfied with soft power. He wanted absolute influence. He wanted to change behavior on a scale that could not be reversed by the caprice of public opinion. He wanted the people who once laughed at him to be unable to deride him any longer, for them to, instead, move exactly as he desired. He began to select targets. Not at first the people who had been cruel to him as children. Some of them had drifted into ordinary lives, salted by the quiet of time. He selected instead nodes of influence. Politicians who made decisions about public policy, CEOs who controlled information pipelines, journalists who set narratives in motion. He reasoned that if he could redirect these nodes, the ripples would travel far. So far that the boy who had been mocked would be beyond recognition. Thomy's method involved stages: seed, sink, and sway. Seed, using legitimate deployments of time bands and reverie capsules to distribute subtle patterning. People who trusted the brand would use the devices and unknowingly receive minor suggestion frames, associative nudges that favored particular images, phrases, or emotional states. The more people used his devices, the more signatures he could calibrate and refine. Sync, combining users into synchronized sessions. During these sessions, tiny variations of language, accent, and rhythm were used to introduce potent symbolic constructs, symbols that, when repeated in the right frequency and arrangement, would resonate deeper in the associative fabric of a mind. Thomy's engineers wrote code that was half mathematics and half poetry. Sway, activating the lattice to encourage action. For a political leader, the lattice might emphasize priorities and emotional valences that made certain decisions feel self-evident. For a journalist, it might promote framing that made a particular narrative seem urgent and irresistible. For a CEO, it might reduce the psychic resistance to a risky technological pivot. The world changed in tiny increments at first. Readers noticed little shifts in the tone of articles, traffic flows smoothed in oddly predicted ways. Certain policies felt as if they were the inevitable consensus. People praised the company's ability to make systems more humane. Thomy smiled privately and calculated the geometries of the spread. But influence, once exercised, grew hungry. The lattice began to feed itself. People who had been nudged began to propose new uses for the tech, sometimes in good faith, sometimes out of ambition. Thomy allowed some of those uses. He blocked others. His network was careful, controlled by algorithms that prioritized the objectives he had programmed. The reverberations across society increased his wealth and his followers. His army, he told himself, had begun with a single defensible premise: to create a world where cruelty like his childhood cruelty could not easily exist. But cruelty is not so neatly excised by power. It mutates.
Long before the world learned Thomy's name in the way they would later, adored and feared, others had learned it as an answer to a problem. A small team of investigative journalists began to notice anomalies. They tracked procurement contracts and oddly timed firmware updates. A neuroscientist noticed a pattern in clinical outcomes that did not match expected placebo thresholds. A dissident developer in one of Thomy's labs found a code fragment that triggered myelin-like reinforcement when certain subliminal sequences were played. These sparks of suspicion began to converge into a wire of investigation. But Thomy had anticipated this too. He cultivated plausible deniability. He had a legion of legitimate studies, partnerships with prestigious universities, powerful PR defenses, and a legal team adept at the art of delay. When whistleblowers emerged, their claims were muffled with non-disclosure agreements or drowned in carefully orchestrated rebuttals. And then there were the people who had been directly affected by Thomy's devices in ways he had not fully intended, those personal tragedies that leaked out like oil. In a small northern city, a woman used a modified time band to work through the grief of losing her child. She reported emergent fanatic beliefs, the visitation of visions that compelled her to act on impulses against her own judgment. In another town, a manager connected to a reverie capsule in a creative think tank began proposing a corporate policy that would permanently alter employee surveillance, citing an epiphany formed in a dream. These things, initially dismissed as individual pathology or corporate enthusiasm, assembled like beads on a string. The first public scandal arrived as a leak. An open-source developer posted snippets of firmware and screenshots of experimental code. At first, it was labeled malicious tampering. Thomy's communications team smiled, reassuring the public. The stock shuddered, then regained buoyancy. But every scandal kneeled to the market's hunger. Scandals that could be explained away were expensive, but not terminal. The next move came not from Thomy's adversaries, but from his own conscience. Or perhaps it came from something equally human: fatigue. There were nights when Thomy walked the rooftops of his compounds and felt, thin as morning mist, the weight of his own invention. He had built an orchestra to correct slights done to him in playgrounds and corridors, but the instruments themselves had a will. It was the will of systems that multiplied outcomes and eroded margin for error. Machines, once set in motion, are not moral actors. Humans are. Yet Thomy had blurred the line between his will and the public good. A part of him began to imagine a world in which he could absolve himself. He thought often of the very children who had laughed at him, picturing them transformed into people who would live gentle, contented lives. He told himself that influence could be used to seed kindness. The problem was that influence acted like a sledge. It could flatten cruelty, but it could also compress the messy, essential variety of human choice into a single channel. That tension between philanthropic arrogance and unrepentant hunger for retribution came to a head in a series of events that would be called later the Fall and the Reckoning. It began when a coalition of nations, spurred by mounting evidence and a whistleblower's irrefutable leak, convened an international commission. The commission recommended strict oversight. They called for audits, transparency, and a temporary moratorium on certain uses of subjective immersion technologies. For a moment, the world thought the institutions of governance might reassert themselves. Thomy responded with a public speech that balanced contrition and vision. He conceded that his technologies required regulation and proposed to submit to the most stringent audits. He offered open-source partnerships and invited third-party researchers into his labs. It was a masterful performance. He appeared to cooperate while preserving hidden code branches under the claim of proprietary protection. The speech bought time, and time was the resource he used to enact the next stage of his plan. During the months of apparent cooperation, Thomy accelerated. He pushed updates to devices already in use worldwide. Updates that, by their outward description, were bug fixes and performance improvements. But within these updates lay the lattice's final pattern: a combination of firmware signatures, cross-device harmonics, and a global watermark that, when activated, would heighten suggestibility across cohorts using his tech. He chose the activation carefully. He selected a day when his platforms would be most used, a global day of remembrance and reflection, synchronized across regions by events that relied on his systems, traffic optimizations, streaming of memorial programs, and virtual experiences hosted by his Reverie networks. On that day, as billions watched and interacted with experiences shaped in part by Thomy's systems, the lattice went live. The activation did not produce a fiction of instant puppetry. People did not suddenly lose agency. Instead, it chirped like a tuning fork inside the mind, a multitude of small biases, repeated enough to sway decisions, to nudge speech, and to amplify certain emotional valences while dampening others. At first, results were subtle. Legislative votes shifted by a small percentage. Editorial headlines trended toward favored narratives. Markets pivoted in predictable directions. But as those nodes shifted, their decisions reshaped incentives and contexts, and the changes amplified. The lattice's geometry multiplied influence in ways Thomy had modeled in private, with equations and scenario simulations that predicted probability like weather maps. Then something happened Thomy had not expected: resistance. Resistance came from unlikely quarters. An elderly radio host in a remote town who refused to use Thomy's platforms and continued to speak in a cadence outside the lattice's reinforcement. A child whose imagination the Reverie capsule could not contain because, for reasons of temperament and poverty, she used the machine in ways the designers had not foreseen. She threaded her own simple stories into shared sessions, and those stories set up interference that blurred the lattice's harmonics. Small pockets where the lattice couldn't hold became seedbeds of critical counter-narratives. Moreover, human systems have an appetite for diversity. When the lattice attempted to flatten certain behaviors, it produced side effects: predictable consumer choices leading to bottlenecks, policy shifts that provoked public debate, and market corrections that left cascading anomalies. In a world interconnected by speech and code, bulldozing a lane for uniform behavior produced turbulence that fed back into the system. Thomy had to respond. He pushed harder, sharpened signatures, closed loopholes, targeted individuals who displayed signs of resistance. His team, once buoyed by idealism, found themselves in moral morasses. Some resigned. A few tried to reason with him in private. Others attempted to leak documents and were silenced by legal means. The world, now partly aware of the orchestration, reacted with a strange mixture of awe, fear, and fury. It was in the middle of this crucible that Thomy made his most dangerous choice. He decided that the only way to secure his vision permanently was to build an army, human minds that had been reshaped to follow. He envisioned a march of people whose wills, not entirely erased but guided, would insist on his designs. He imagined a vanguard, steadfast and uncomplaining, who would dismantle the old systems that permitted mockery and cruelty. He imagined streets free from the old taunts. To create such an army, he took steps that shocked even his closest confidants. He used the Reverie capsule to orchestrate shared dream sessions of intense narrative and forced alignment. In those sessions, specially prepared sequences of imagery connected with the time-band firmware to reinforce obedience. People left sessions not only moved but also disciplined, ready for a time to accept direction from leaders who spoke with the resonance cultivated by Thomy's tech. The first public sighting of Thomy's army was in a city square. People moving with measured steps, their faces serene, their actions coordinated not by explicit commands but by a shared rhythm they had internalized. News outlets streamed footage. Some viewers reported goosebumps, others felt a chill. The army was not violent, while Thomy wanted it to merely be an instrument of persuasion. Its presence alone changed the tenor of public discourse. Governments reacted. Some attempted to ban the devices, others enacted emergency regulations. The markets trembled. Civil liberties groups sued. A coalition of independent researchers and activists began to organize a campaign to dismantle Thomy's network. They designed counter-firmware, analog disruptions, and public education campaigns to inoculate people against suggestion. The chessboard had become messy. Thomy, for all his brilliance, had underestimated the complexity of the human heart. The army he built included people of varied intentions. Some followed blindly and with contented conviction. Others were in a liminal state, caught between autonomy and the program. When some of Thomy's operatives tried to force more aggressive measures, arrests, removals of dissenters, a chain reaction occurred. The world, which had been nudged and prodded for so long, began to push back with a force born of unpredictable human solidarity. The most personal turn in this story came when Thomy encountered one of his childhood tormentors by chance at a university gala. The man, older now, his face cut by the ordinary compromises of life, did not recognize Thomy at first. When recognition came, it was accompanied by a quick, defensive laugh. Thomy felt a heat rise that he had hoped his network would have cooled. He had built algorithms to eradicate pain, but nothing in his equations accounted for the rawness of a real conversation. The old man was not cruel in any intentionally theatrical way. He had survived childhood with the small cruelties of other people and had learned different armor. He apologized in a way that surprised Thomy. There was, in that apology, an ordinary human sorrow. Thomy had a moment, an electric, brief window, where he could have dismantled his plan. He realized that revenge would not return what had been stolen from him. It would only breed the same ruin he had endured. Yet that realization did not unmake him. It was late. Thomy had invested years, fortunes, and pieces of himself into a structure too vast to disassemble with a moral epiphany. He felt both relief and panic. He could imagine a redemption, but the costs were immediate and terrifying. Confessing would topple governments, ruin countless people who had come to rely on his companies, and likely plunge markets into carnage. He understood, as a man of systems, the leverage his actions had over billions. In a late-night meeting with his most trusted engineer, an old friend named Mira, Thomy spoke in confessions that trembled. Mira, who had once helped him design the time band, now sat across from him, gaunt and tired from moral battle.
We can stop it. We can shut down the lattice and release a patch that resets devices. We can tell the world everything. We can pay the price.
Thomy listened. The moment that followed was the kind where lives rearrange on a hinge. He saw the ledger of his life, the hours of mockery carved into him, the faces of those who had laughed, the smiling patients who had told him their stories of relief. He saw also the faces of the followers in the square, soothing, obedient, and felt an unexpected tenderness. He had, in a way, constructed himself into a moral puzzle. If he destroyed the lattice publicly, he would be the villain in many narratives. If he preserved it, he would risk becoming the architect of systemic oppression. In the end, he chose a third path, one that was neither confession nor consolidation, but gambit. Thomy arranged a global event unlike any other. He would stage an experience so visceral that the world would have to witness something profound. He would invite critics and believers and the indifferent. He would present a demonstration of the time band and the reverie capsule, but framed in such stark honesty that audiences could not ignore the moral questions. The night of the demonstration was rain-softened. The auditorium thrummed with expectation. The live stream alone pulled millions. Thomy stepped onto the stage without pretense. He spoke with a voice that had been tempered by long reflection. He omitted none of the detail, and yet he omitted what he could not surrender. He revealed much: his ambition, his pain, the technology's potentials and dangers. He confessed the lattice's architecture but claimed he had created it out of a desire to protect, an argument both pathetic and piercing. Then he did something no one expected. He invited volunteers to sit in the demonstration devices. He invited his critics to press the button. He invited those who had been harmed to tell their stories. The cameras did not pan away. He told a story of childhood in a quiet house, of mockery, of a calculated resolve that matured into domination. He told it without embellishment, without plaintive pleas for sympathy. At the core of the demonstration he staged, he presented an image that he had designed himself. Two parallel visions of the future. In one, systems of suggestion shape behavior toward uniformity. Citizens moving in measured steps. Public life neat and predictable, but hollowed of surprise. In the other, a messy, vibrant world where mistakes happen and cruelty exists, but where individuals can speak up and be heard, where apology and forgiveness remain possible. He asked the audience publicly and plainly to pick which future they preferred. For a time, the world seemed suspended between two breaths. People voted, argued, hesitated. Then the network he had built and the counterforces arrayed against it collided with visible force. Hackers pushed patches that introduced noise into the lattice. Civil movements called for legal action. Some governments banned the devices entirely. The stock market crashed in a day of stark volatility. Thomy, in the middle of this, felt a brutal clarity. Control could not be sustained without crushing the unpredictable thing that made life worth living. The demonstration did not end in neat resolution. It ended in a wound, a complicated, necessary wound. Thomy turned over control. He released the source code openly, stripped proprietary locks, and invited global researchers to study, audit, and rework the algorithms. He imposed rules on himself and asked for no charity. He accepted legal consequences. There were trials, of course. Courtrooms became arenas where humanities and sciences clashed. Some of Thomy's followers felt betrayed. Others felt liberated. Mira testified. Whistleblowers found a public voice and became, paradoxically, heroes and targets. The world reeled and recovered, but the story's hardest moment came later, when the ripple of consequences reached the people close to Thomy's bone. His parents, who had loved a small, quiet boy and watched him rise and change, were caught in the tangle. They had, innocently, invested in initiatives and had become public figures by proximity. The press, never kind, searched for faces to pin the narrative upon. Thomy's father, who had passed away during the height of the controversy, became a contested symbol. His mother, aged now, faced cameras that wanted to piece her grief into a morality play. Thomy watched the fallout with a new knowledge of cost. Public penance did not erase private suffering. He had set in motion sequences of pain that would travel and settle in lives like dust. He had, at times, convinced himself the dust was temporary and that he could sweep it away. He now saw that dust could become part of the very structure of people. In the courtroom, the sentences were severe but not total. Thomy would be barred from corporate leadership, mandated to work with oversight committees, and required to fund restorative programs. Many urged for harsher measures. Some declared the verdict too lenient. The legal outcomes could not repair the many small cruelties he had helped produce. But they marked an attempt by human institutions to legislate the boundary between genius and harm. Years followed that rearranged world. Some technologies were banned. Others were re-engineered with new ethical guardrails. Thompson's name, once a brand and then a behemoth, became shorthand for the dance between promise and peril. He lived thereafter with a reduced banner, a quiet architect stripped of his empire, but not of the knowledge he had amassed.
In the quiet that came after, Thomy discovered a different kind of life practice. He found in gardens and in small acts the patient, humble work of repair. He taught in an unadorned university studio where students could speak without surveillance. He funded scholarships specifically for children who had been bullied, and he traveled to small towns, places that had once produced his tormentors, offering listening sessions, not as correction, but as companionship. Not all forgave him. Many never would. That was part of the hard meaning he had to accept. What he could do, what he had to do, was to build a legacy that acknowledged harm and sought reparation. The ending of Thomy's story is not triumphant, nor is it wholly tragic. It is complicated and, in its complexity, hopeful. He lived out his later years removed from the bright stages, a man who had tasted the two extremes of human possibility, the joy of discovery and the seduction of totalizing control. He died with a small, quiet circle of people around him, former colleagues who had chosen a different path, students whose work was mindful and generous, and a mother who had forgiven in ways that were her own. At his funeral, a young woman read a story she had carried for years, a parable about cities and weather. The core of the parable was simple. A storm can flatten fields, but storms also refill rivers. The seeds that a storm scatters may grow in soil that has been changed forever, perhaps for better, perhaps not. The hope is not in erasing the storm, but in the careful tending of whatever sprouts after. The world moved on. New technologies rose and fell. Conversations about consent, agency, and the ethics of immersive technology evolved. Thomy's name lived on in textbooks as both cautionary tale and a case study in technological hubris. His companies, broken into many parts and remade under scrutiny, contributed to safer designs and helped draft legal frameworks that future innovators would follow. The meaning, when people argued about it, varied. Some claimed Thomy's fate was proof that brilliance must be bound by community. Others said that society must not kill the inventiveness that births transformation. The truest answer lies somewhere in the knots. Humanity needs both the spark of invention and the slow institutions that steward those sparks responsibly. And in the quiet house where the story began, there was a small plaque that Thomy's mother kept on a shelf. It said, in a handwriting she had once made for a small boy's drawings, "Live with curiosity, forgive often, beware the cleverness that does not listen." The plaque outlived both of them and, like a small bell, reminded the next generation of something simple and complicated. Intelligence without empathy is an instrument. Tempered by care, it can be a gift. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If Thomy's journey moved you, if it made you think, dream, or feel something, please take a moment to support this channel. Your subscription, your like, and your comment help more than you can imagine. And if you want to go a step further and help me keep creating stories like this one, you can support me directly on Ko-fi. Every little bit truly helps. You'll find the link in the description below. Thank you for listening, for believing in stories, and for being part of this community. Until the next story, stay curious, stay kind, and never stop dreaming.